Hello, everyone. I am making sure everything is going okay. I think we're live. We are having trouble. Zoom is not wanting to live stream to Facebook or YouTube right now. So if you have friends out there who are trying to connect and they're frantically texting you, not knowing why they can't get in, please let them know that the YouTube and Facebook are not playing well right now. So they can still join via Zoom. They can still go in and register and join via Zoom and get it that way. We are also recording this, so it will be put up on YouTube and Facebook later. But sometimes these things don't work, and today is one of those days. So I want to welcome you to the September 2020 Legacies and Lunch, a program of the Cowles Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. I'm Heather Register-Zabindon, Outreach Coordinator for the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art. The Roberts Library is located in downtown Little Rock, across Rock Street from the main library, and houses the galleries at Library Square, the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. The Roberts Library Research Room and the galleries at Library Square are now open on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Fridays from 9 to 11 and 1 until 5. That early time slot is set aside exclusively for high-risk populations. Like other Cowles branches, we are limiting the number of patrons in the building at one time. We ask that you call ahead and make an appointment to reserve your spot in the research room or the galleries at Library Square. For patrons wishing to use our closed stacks materials in the research room, you must request your items at least 2 business days in advance. Please go to robertslibrary.org for all the specifics before planning your visit. For details about other Cowles branches, the days and times that they are open, please go to cowles.org, that's CALS.org, or call the specific branch. We will continue to do lots of virtual programming for the foreseeable future. Library programs include story times, cooking classes, craft activities, and fun podcasts. You can find most of these programs archived on Cowles' YouTube channel. If you go to youtube.com and search Central Arkansas Library System, that's where you'll find those. Then subscribe to the channel to get notifications of when the latest videos are posted. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to fill your feed with interesting, fun, and educational content. So one of the things that we are doing here at Roberts Library, we're collecting stories, photos, and art related to the COVID-19 experience of Arkansans. We did a similar collecting initiative last year during the Arkansas River flood. People go to Roberts Library, or please go, not people, please go to robertslibrary.org for more information or to submit your photographs and stories. We want to hear from you. Your story is important to Arkansas history. The speaker will answer questions at the end of the session. Please type your questions in the chat box in Zoom. If you have tech questions or tech issues, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I will try to help you, if I can, remotely. Now today's program. This year, 2020, marks the 50th anniversary of the publication of D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. For me, as a high school junior, this was required reading, and that single assignment contributed more than I ever realized to my chosen profession as a public historian. The Central Arkansas Library System and the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art are celebrating the anniversary of this American classic with a series of lectures and exhibits that recognize the enduring importance and power of Brown's groundbreaking volume. This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Division of Arkansas Heritage, funded by the 1/8 cents conservation sales tax, Amendment 75. For more details about our celebration events, go to cows.org. I want to begin today's program with an acknowledgement of the Native peoples who have stewarded this land through the generations. I would like to acknowledge that this program is being held on the traditional lands of the Quapaw, Osage, and Caddo people, and pay my respect to elders, both past and present. Thank you for joining us for today's Legacies in Lunch, now in its 21st year. The 50th anniversary of the publication of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee offers us a chance to look back on the impact it had at the time and to think about how our understanding of American Indian history has evolved since then. Brown's book caused quite a stir among its admirers and critics, encouraging a surge in both popular and scholarly interest in Native history that has persisted to today. The scholarship in particular has broadened considerably our understanding of the American Indian story and its essential part in the wider narrative of the country's common past. Elliott West, the Alumni Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, is our speaker today. He is a specialist in the history of the American West and the American Indian. He has published 7 books, 4 of which have won national awards. He has twice been recognized as the university, or as his university's, UA Fayetteville's University, Teacher of the Year, and in 2009 was one of the 3 finalists for the Robert Foster Cherry Award as the Outstanding Classroom Teacher in the nation. So please help me welcome Dr. West by giving a warm virtual welcome. And now, let's switch. There we go. Okay, Dr. West, I ask you to start your video and unmute yourself. I thought I did. There we go.
Here.
Okay, now there we go. Yay! we're gonna get through this today. Okay, so now you can share your screen.
Okay, I'm sharing the screen, but I'll need to pull the video up again. Can you hold on just a second?
Yeah, that's fine.
Here we are. Can you see it now?
No, try the green shared screen button in the middle. Click on that, and then it should give you some choices.
I don't have a shared.
Oh, well, maybe that's odd. We had it a minute ago. Do you see?
Hold on a second. Let me do
okay.
This. You have it now?
Nope. Let me, oh, hang on. No. I'm sorry. It's on my fault. I don't know what, really, this is being all weird now. Okay, so now, do you have the big green shared screen button at the bottom in your toolbar?
No, I don't.
Okay, then let me look. I'm gonna make you the host. Okay, now see if you have it. Are you in the Zoom window?
Am I what?
Are you in the Zoom window?
I just have my PowerPoint on the screen.
Okay, so down down in the tool
screen.
Yeah, so do you see the share screen button now?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so click that, and then it should give you choices, and one of them should be PowerPoint.
Okay.
There we go. Yay. We did it. Okay. So everybody, here is Dr. West, and I'm gonna disappear and mute myself and let you take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to give this presentation. I apologize. I am a knuckle walking person when it comes to anything digital. So sorry about that. I'll try to do my best to at least get through the PowerPoint. It's a pleasure here to take part in this excellent program that's been going on for so many years. I'll give you greetings from the semi-operative campus of the U of A at Fayetteville. Let me begin a bit with my own personal background with Dee Brown and with this book. Came out in 1970, of course, 50 years ago this year. That year was I was close to the end of my graduate study at the University of Colorado when that book came out. And I left some very broad hints to my parents that I would sure like to have that book for Christmas. And sure enough, they gave it to me. I read it voraciously just the first few days after the 25th. Loved it. Then I came to Fayetteville. After teaching in Texas for several years, came to Fayetteville to the campus here and learned that Dee Brown lived at Little Rock. So I wrote him a note, asked if there's some time maybe I could come down and we could meet up somewhere. I'd buy him lunch or something. He very graciously invited me to his home. So I drove down and had a wonderful few hours with this kind and generous and very interesting man. It was I loved it. It was a great experience. In 2012, there was a new edition put out of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, an expanded illustrated edition. And this new edition included sort of a side essay, small essays by various historians elaborating on certain points made in the book. And I eagerly accepted the invitation to take part in that. So I'm part of that second edition of this book, this expanded edition of this book. Finally, the Western History Association is the primary national association of my field, the history of the American West, history of the American frontier. 1998, I was chosen as president of the WHA, and one of the perks of the presidency is that you are allowed to choose two persons who you believe deserve lifetime memberships in the WHA. And of those two people, one of my choices was D. Alexander Brown, my fellow Arkansan down in Little Rock. So I have something of a history with Dee Brown and with this very well-known book. The next thing to say, however, is that this book, as Heather pointed out, was not greeted with unanimous applause, especially by professional historians, academic historians. In fact, it was pretty brutally criticized. When I announced my choice of Dee Brown as for this lifetime membership at the WHA with this large crowd in front of me, the response, I have to say, was well, let's just call it tepid. It was a tepid response. Why? What was it? What was it that historians found to criticize? In some cases, pretty brutally, this book. Partly, they said, well, there are lots of factual errors in it. There are lots of misleading statements in it, and that's true. It has to be said. That is true. But that wasn't the real nut of their concern. What was it? It was, I think, because Dee Brown in this book sets out very consciously to sort of tug at our emotions, to lay before us the tragic arc of American Indian history during the period that he focuses on, that is roughly from the Civil War to the turn of the century. He makes no effort, I think, to disguise the fact that he's really trying to plead a case. It's an apologia. It's quite clearly he sets out, to use our emotions, to appeal to our emotions, to persuade us to the tragedy of this story. Well, it's basically a simple story. What he does in this book is to take to refer back indirectly to the story, the way the story was told, dominating in the 19th century and since surviving surprisingly and far into the 20th century. That story, in histories and in popular culture, that story is basically very simple. In this story, I can advance a slide here. In this story, the Indian peoples are consistently the aggressors. The pioneers are consistently the victims. It's a simple story, straightforward story. It's very clear who the heroes and who the villains are in this story. It's there in the histories of the 19th century. It's there certainly in illustrations like this. It's there in popular novels of the 19th century. And it continues into the 20th century. And for example, in popular culture, in movies like John Ford's The Searchers, which the Comanches in this case are the bad guys, are the villains. Well, what Dee does in this book is to take that story and flip it. The way he tells the story, the Indian history of the American West in this book is that the whites are consistently the aggressors, the Indians are consistently the victims. In many ways, then it could not be more different from that earlier story. The characters are all are very different. The story itself is very different. The tone of it, but it's still, both stories are still very, very simple and straightforward, appealing to the emotions. That was the problem. That was the problem that that critics had. Why is that? Historians should at least traffic in nuance and complexity. That's what we're supposed to do. It's in our contract, basically. Well, that's because history, after all, is simply the story of what people have done. And that means that necessarily history is complicated and messy because people are complicated and messy. But complex and nuanced are two words that I don't think anybody can rightfully use to describe the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It's not. It's simply not. So in that sense, that was the problem I think that most historians had with this book. It took an old story that everybody rejected and it just turned it upside down so that now it was a new story, but it was still simplistic, overdone. So then why do I admire Dee Brown? And why do I admire Dee Brown's book so much? Still do. I still do. It's because I think Brown set out not so much to convince us of the truth, the absolute truth of this story. What he was trying to do in writing this book was to use this sort of a shock treatment to force us to look again at American Indian history during the period he was talking about and during the period before. To look at it anew, look at it freshly, to rethink it, to revise it. It's a good word, revise. The vise and the revise comes from, of course, from vision, see it. So he's encouraging us to revise it in the sense of to look again. Let's look again at this story. What can it tell us? What can it tell us that we haven't understood yet? That followed. In fact, from 1970 on, there has been this extraordinary outpouring of works, historical works, literary works on American Indian history. Now, who can say whether this book and Dee Brown was the cause of that? We can't really say, but it sure was true. I went this just a sort of an exercise. Went through our library's catalog, looked through it, and I just typed in North American Indians history. There was something like 180 books, and I flipped through it, and the opinion, the impression quite quickly, is that the vast majority of those books have been published since 1970, easily 80% of them. So it's fair to say that there has been more historical work done and more historical work in different areas, new historical work, genuinely new historical work, using more techniques, different methodologies, more materials in the past 50 years than there has been in all of the writing on American Indian history before that. I don't know whether Dee was responsible for that, how responsible he was for it, but I personally believe that the publication of this book contributed mightily to this remarkable renaissance in the writing of this very important part of the story, the history of the United States. So what have we learned? What I was asked to do here is to sort of summarize some of the major changes in the way that the Indian history of the American West has been told in the light of this new scholarship. And I'll try to do that. I'll make a few points and try to address the question: how has Dee Brown's version of this story changed in the light of this new scholarship? A few points. Point number one: if Bury My Heart in Wounded Knee tells this sort of horrific story of the tragedy of American Indians, we know now that in certain places and at certain times in the history of the American West, that story was worse, much worse, much, much worse than the way that Dee Brown tells it in this book. I think the best example of this is the story of California after the gold rush, after 1848. What we know now, there have been a few closely documented books on this topic. What happens to American Indians after the discovery of gold in 1848 and the American acquisition of California in that same year. What we know now that this was a genuine case of genocide. It's a term that's thrown around awfully easy nowadays, but this was the real deal. This is a true genocidal period from about 1848 until about 1870. What did it consist of? What do we know now? Well, for example, in California, there were militias formed formally, purposely, to kill Indians, to fall down in these rancherias and to slaughter as many Indians as possible. These militias were funded by the legislature of California. They provided money and they passed bond issues to repay the expenses of these Indian killing expeditions, these Indian killing militias. The California legislature, in turn, was reimbursed by the U.S. Congress, passed laws to pay the state of California to repay for them, to provide for them the funds that they in turn had given to fund these militias. The U.S. Army, while in some cases it tried to protect Indians, also took part in this, killing thousands of Indians themselves in various raids and various episodes. The person who has studied this most closely shows in this meticulously documented study, shows that between 1848 and 1873, that is in 25 years, a minimum of 13,000 Indians were murdered and as many as 27,000 were murdered. That's an extraordinary number, far more than the Indians killed in those more famous most famous Indian wars unfolding out on the Great Plains, many, many times more than that. And that's just the start of it. Thousands of others, tens of thousands of other Indians died from other indirect causes, including starvation, as they were herded onto these small reserves that could not possibly support them. There was de facto slavery, laws passed that provided for in effect, the enslavement of Indians up until their maturity. There were well-documented open kidnappings and sale of Indian children. You could open up a newspaper and see ads where you could buy for $50, you could buy an Indian kid, bring it into your house as sort of a pet or a domestic. The result of all of this together was a cataclysmic decline of Indian populations in the new state of California. Here's the best estimates we have. 1770, that goes back to the first Spanish contact with California. Estimated population is about 310,000. By the time of the gold rush, that had dropped by more than half. But then look what happens. In the next 12 years, it drops by more than half again. And then move 40 years, into the future up to the turn of the century. 16,000. What we're looking at here then is basically a 90% drop in population between 1840 and half a century, between 1848 and 1900. So point number one, if you were to focus in on California and move back a little bit before the period that D. Brown looks at, he looks at only from about 1860 to 1900. You just turn the clock back a little bit and look in this one place in California, you see a story that's far worse than anything, far more horrific than anything that D. Brown wrote about in that book. So if the point of Bury My Heart of Wounded Knee is one of tragedy and of disaster for Indians, he didn't know, he just started telling that story. There was at least a couple of places. The same thing I think was happening in the 1860s in parts of the Southwest, Arizona, for instance. So point number one. Point number two, on the other hand, if again, you move back a little bit before the time that D. Brown writes about, back into the earlier 19th century, on the other hand, the story is far more positive for Indians, far more positive story. And ironically, it's because of what the white intruders brought with them. It's because of the arrival of these white invaders that if you look elsewhere, you see this extraordinary rise of affluence and power and a new life blossoming for Indians. How does that happen? Where does it happen? And how does it happen? The place to focus in this case is not California, which is catastrophic, but if you sort of move over to the center of the United States, to the Great Plains, there you see a very, very different story unfolding. And it centers around the coming of horses, the coming of the horse, a fascinating part of American history that gets virtually no attention in our textbooks. The coming of the horse culture. Interestingly, horses originated on the southern Great Plains. They evolved in the United States and specifically over in the area of Oklahoma, New Mexico, Texas, Kansas. If I live in Fayetteville, Arkansas right now, if I were to drive about 2 or 3 hours to the west, I would be in the place where horses began, where horses came from, evolving over about 50 million years into the modern horse, Equus caballos. And there they proliferated on the plains and across North America. They migrated northward up into what's today Canada, into what's today Alaska. They crossed over into Siberia, what's today Siberia, via that the Bering Land Bridge that was exposed during the last ice age. There they proliferated again and evolved on the central steppes of Central Asia. But at the same time, they became extinct. They disappeared here, where they had come from originally. So they vanished about 10,000 years ago. And then, of course, the Spanish bring them back, and they began to prosper again on the Great Plains. Well, around 1680, horses began to spread out of the southern, in the Southwest, around Santa Fe in the Rio Grande Valley. You see the date down there on this. And in 1680, the Pueblo Indians drove the Spanish out of that area. And with that, the horse population just exploded northward and westward and eastward into much of the far west. You can see on this map those dates in which horses and horse cultures began to were appearing and settling into different parts of the country. 1700, they're all the way up there with the Shoshones. Another 30 years, they're with the Nez Perce in the Pacific Northwest. Another 20 years after that with the Cree and the Blackfeet and the Assiniboine over there in the Great Plains. The Comanches, of course, down in the Southern Plains. So what we see here between 1680 and about 1780 is the rise of this new way of life in the American West, specifically, above all, on the Great Plains. Because the Great Plains is, with the exception of the steppes of Central Asia, the American Great Plains is the largest pasture on Earth. And it's, after all, where the horses were born, where they came from. So they fit in beautifully to that part of the world, and the Indian peoples there took advantage of it. They very quickly adapted to the coming of horses and built these extraordinary new ways of life. With the horses, they could travel farther and faster. With horses, they could hunt far more effectively. And with that hunting, then, they could take the fruits of that hunt and they could trade much farther. And they begin to trade with European trade goods to bring in things that they could never have before. Their populations rose. One of the things that happens here is that with the coming of horses to the Great Plains suddenly are some of the most valuable, attractive real estate in North America. And one result of that is that all of these different Indian peoples begin to move on to it, adopting the horse, making the horse part of their whole way of life, taking advantage of it, and rising to this new extraordinary time of affluence and power. Just about any Indian group that you would associate with the Great Plains, they haven't been there for time immemorial. They are relatively recent arrivals. The Sioux, the Lakota, the Western Sioux, the Comanches on the Southern Plains, the Cheyennes of the Central Plains, the Arapahoes of the Central Plains, the Blackfeet of the Northern Plains, the Kiowas of the Southern Plains. All of those groups have immigrated onto the plains during this period we're talking about now because it was the place to be. It was the place to be. This was what I like to call the other American Revolution. It's roughly coincident with that one that we're more familiar with on the Atlantic coast. So as the United States was winning its independence from Great Britain in 1775 to 1783, this other revolution was unfolding on the Great Plains. And it was also saw the rise of new centers of power, rise in the creation of new peoples, of new cultures. It's quite a story. It resulted in scenes like this that we always associate with American Indians. Well, of course, there are hundreds of tribes even today in this, and great diversity of cultures and peoples, but this is the one that sort of sits in our mind. And look at it. We associate it with power. We associate it with independence. They're riding horses, and they're holding lances with metal tips. They have taken advantage of the coming of Europeans to build this new way of life, and it's one of extraordinary power and affluence. Here's a scene, an imagined scene of a native village of the Great Plains. Look at those large lodges, those large teepees. You can have a much bigger, like mansions, a much bigger teepee because now you have horses to drag them around. You can hunt much more effectively. You can see the scene out there in the back. And with those, with the hunting of bison, you can take those hides off, turn them into robes. You can trade them for all sorts of goods from the outside. If you were to walk to visit one of these lodges, one of these teepees, what would you see? You might see a carpet on the floor and bed ticking as insulation on the inside walls, things made in New England textile mills. You might be invited to have a cup of coffee. There'll be a coffee grinder, grinding beans from Cuba, a coffee grinder from New England. And it'll be flavored with New Orleans molasses. You'll find all kinds of other goods traded in from the outside. The great Kiowa warrior and leader, Satanta, had a habit living in one of these lodges. When he was having someone for dinner, to call them to dinner, he would step outside of his lodge and blow on a French horn to summon people dinner time. What a way of life. And remember, all of this was happening as things were starting to unravel completely out in California. What we see here then is what I was mentioning before, what I was describing before is the way history is. It's not simple. It's not simple. There are all sorts of conflicting things going on at the same time. Well, this is a way of life then that was revolutionary for Indian peoples. It reminds us that, in fact, at the time of the coming of the white frontier in the early 19th century, these were the centers of power. These were the centers of power. These great empires of horseback Indians to the north, the Sioux, the Western Sioux, the people that Dee writes about so eloquently in their decline and collapse. To the south, the Comanches, others. these sort of horseback empires that together dominated the middle part of North America, an area that's roughly the size of Europe. Think of a European-sized empire, native empire, and the power that represented. That's also part of the story. That's also an important part of the Indian history of the American West. Now, this happens, of course, through conflict among these tribes. So this story is not one of Indian aggressors and white victims. It's not one of white aggressors and Indian victims. This is a story of Indian aggressors and Indian victims. Brutal warfare among these different groups. And it affects American history in complicated ways. One of the things we've learned because of recent research is this. In our war with Mexico, 1846 to 1848, if you know much about that war, there was some recent programs on it here. If you know much about that war, you know that the United States was able to win very quick victories in the Southwest and in northern Mexico. One of the things we now understand is one of the reasons for these rapid, easy victories by US forces was this. The Comanches and the Apaches had so devastated northern Mexico with these raids that northern Mexico was virtually a no man's land. It was depopulated, virtually depopulated. So the US Army was able basically sort of to march in and take it over. In other words, the Comanches and the Apaches helped the United States, indirectly, of course, not purposely, helped the United States win the war with Mexico and therefore to expand to the Pacific coast and to California, where things completely fell apart with Indian peoples out there. Messy, complicated. Well, this second point, that the story is one not only of horror in a place like California, but of a great surge of power in places like the Great Plains, leads to an obvious question when we focus again on the plains, on this remarkable way of life that came with the coming of the horse. And the question is, so what happened? What happened when we move into the period that D. Brown writes about after 1860? Because his story, of course, focuses on the collapse of this way of life, the defeat of these Indian peoples. How did that happen? Given this other American Revolution, what undid it? How do we explain that? Well, in Dee's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, it's once again a fairly straightforward story. And it's basically a story, while he talks about settlers and other developments, it's fundamentally a story with Indian peoples on the one side, and on the other side, the US government and its policies, and US military. So it's a story. How does he explain it? Well, it's a conflict between the US government and what it's trying to do and accomplish with the US Army as its strong right arm. And it's a story of Indian peoples who are then broken by these efforts, partly by betrayals, of course, but also simply by force of the American military, and therefore dispossessed. That's Dee's story. Well, of course, that's part of the story. Of course, that was part of it. But it's not really the basis of it. It doesn't really explain very well what happened. In the first place, the Western military was, in many ways, a kind of a joke. It was hopelessly too small. It was underfunded. It was undersupplied. Very high rates of desertion. And the government itself was often very divided in its policies, conflicted in its policies. Just really didn't work that way. So what then defeated them? The basic answer, I think, is the intrusion of a culture and a technological way of life that the Indian people simply could not stand up against. How do you explain that? Well, look at a few things. Numbers. In 1850, the white population in the East outnumbered Indian peoples roughly 60 to 1. 20 years later, 1870, the white population of the East outnumbers Indian peoples in the West about 140 to 1. We're talking a massive population differential. And that population, after 1848, tens of thousands of that far larger population are drawn into the West. Why? 1848, the very year that we acquire the Southwest and we acquire California, and we have acquired Oregon and Texas, 1848, almost exactly coincident with the signing of the treaty that gave us California, gold was discovered in California. In fact, it turned out to be far and away the most lucrative, the most expansive gold discovery in human history up until that time. Instantaneous consequence of that was this flood of population out to the Pacific coast. And soon, the movement across the area between the Missouri River and California of tens of thousands of people, and the development, the growing development of the area inside there. It was discovered after that the West held not only the richest deposits of gold and silver, but also extraordinary other deposits of other resources. Copper, necessary for industrialization. Coal, at that point, at that time, the primary source of energy in the nation. Timber in the Pacific Northwest, we're still basically in the age of wood. We have these enormous forests there. Rich farmland. In other words, what we see after 1848 is probably the most rapid exposure of raw opportunity in American history. And that drew tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of these people onto this land. And they weren't coming to destroy Indians or kill Indians. They were drawn by opportunity. I think it motivates families today when they move from one place to another to take a better job, for instance. Furthermore, these people were aided, this process was aided by technological revolutions, industrialization, as the United States embarks on the second most rapid industrialization of any other country in modern history. Only Japan industrialized faster than we did. And these new industries, of course, need copper, and they need coal, and they need timber. What else? Technological revolutions, what I call the revolution of movement. The development of railroads, the development of the telegraph, the movement of people and things and information is far more rapid and efficient than it has been before, which allows then this movement of a whole new way of life into the West. Those are the sorts of things that explain, I think, what was destroying the Indian way of life. Because these new economies and these new cultures simply could not coexist with the more traditional ways of living that Indian peoples had long enjoyed. Scenes like this, up there, bonanza farms, corporate farms, mining, the lower right, steadying, of course, the building of railroads. This is what defeated Indians. This is what essentially dispossessed Indian peoples. This was behind those conflicts that D. Brown writes about in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. All of this, in turn, is tied into a global corporate marketplace. This is part of a global economy, which in many ways drew upon all of these resources of the West, devouring them and encouraging the rapid development, which in turn brought about this collapse of this native way of life. This is what you might call sort of an economic and cultural concussion. That's what defeated Indian peoples. Great example of that, if you want to look at it, is the destruction of buffaloes or the bison. It's a very famous episode in American Western history. Dee writes about it. He has a chapter called the War to Save the Buffaloes, and they're among the Comanches and the Kiowas. This is sort of probably the most famous example of sort of environmental misbehavior in the history of the West. The way it's often told is that this was a conscious effort by the U.S. government and by the military to destroy the economy of these powerful plains tribes that had risen to those new levels of power with the acquisition of the horse. That, in other words, the government and the military set out to destroy the bison, sent these people out here. Well, it's simply not the case. The story of the decline and near extinction of the bison is well documented, it's well known, and that's not what was happening. Why did it happen? The fact is, between 1872 and 1882, only about 10 years, the population of the plains bison dropped from about 12 million, best guess we have, about 12 million, to under 100. Why? How? What was happening? The reason is pretty simple. The reason is 1870, it was discovered there was a global shortage in leather. Leather used for the sorts of things that we usually associate with boots, belts, and so forth. But more important than that, leather that was being used in industry. At the time that America was industrializing and that other nations were industrializing, you go inside of a factory, there were no synthetic materials yet. And so you would find that the belts in those factories, in those machines of the factories, were made out of leather. The gaskets made out of leather. The lubricants, incidentally, were often animal fats. So they're drawing upon animal populations to make these factories. Well, the leather had come, of course, from cattle up until that time. Cattle in the United States, cattle in places like Argentina. But now there was a dramatic shortage, a drastic shortage of leather because of this rapid expansion of industry. It was discovered in 1870 that bison hides would serve perfectly well for this sort of industrial leather source. And with that, the hunt was on. Suddenly, a raw green buffalo skin hide was worth $2.50, $3, which if you kill enough, they kill 20 or so in a stand, that's a lot of money. And there were hundreds of these buffalo hunters who were drawn out there to supply this market of bison hides, sent back to the east. They rapidly depopulated the bison of the central plains, then down on the southern plains, and then finally the northern plains. So early 1880s then, they were virtually all gone. Why? Why had that happened? It was simply a matter of this global economy. It was supply and demand. In effect, factories ate the bison. Factories ate the bison. So the third point to make is we understand far better now the process of the eventual decline of native independence, how it happened. It was a far more complex story than the ones that you see of simply sort of Indian wars, Indian battles and wars, like that of the Little Bighorn. They're really basically sort of an exclamation point at the end of a long paragraph. They just sort of nail things down. This was the process. This was the process that defeated Indian peoples. Okay, those are the three main points I want to emphasize. But I want to end on one last point. E. Brown's book ends with, it's a very tragic book. It ends with this sort of sad image of Chief Red Cloud, which sums up, which demonstrates the kind of mood that we're supposed to be in. We're supposed to take away from this story that he writes about. Well, this unfortunately can contribute to or can encourage the notion that of the vanishing American, of Indian peoples, there being no real presence of American Indian peoples today, but certainly that is not true. In fact, what we need to emphasize is the extraordinary persistence and the continuing adaptation of Indian peoples, cultural adaptation, their ability to preserve their way of life, despite efforts by this government up until the 1930s to actively suppress that way of life, to destroy Indian languages, to suppress Native American religions. Didn't work. Those cultures are still here. They're still around. And To me, that is one of the most remarkable stories of American history. Now, I want to emphasize that if you go to some reservations, the conditions are still absolutely horrific. Go up to the Sioux reservations in the Northern Plains in North and South Dakota. Go up to the Blackfoot Reservation in Browning, Montana. You go to the Pine Ridge Reservation, the only place in the Western Hemisphere that has a shorter life expectancy than the people on the Pine Ridge Reservation is Haiti. So, sure, some of the conditions remain absolutely scandalous. Other reservations doing quite well. Go over to Oklahoma, the Choctaw people over there have a remarkable story of resilience. To me, one of the most heartening parts of this persistence is the development in the 1970s of Native American educational institutions. These are tribal colleges. There are 34 of them in the country today, and including the university, Haskell Indian Nations University there. They are remarkably successful in turning out graduates. They represent over roughly the past 50 years, represent over those years since the publication of Bury My Heart of Wounded Knee, this remarkable surgence of efforts to not only educate Indian peoples, but to preserve their cultures in all of these universities and colleges, and to give young rising Indian peoples, men and women, a more prominent place in the American economy and American life. And this includes, in universities like mine and others, Native American Studies programs. Here's a Native American Studies program at Yale University. Yale has long been a major center of the study of Western history. And in the past generation or so, it's become a major center of Native American studies. Wonderful faces, these very bright students. Down there in the lower left, it's my good friend, Ned Blackhawk, Eastern Shoshone, who is a professor of history at Yale University, a very distinguished professor himself. What we're seeing here, I think, as part of this, one result of this, is we're now seeing the emergence into academia, into the world of professional historians, of a generation of young Indian peoples, young Indian scholars and historians, who are now beginning to rewrite their own story. So thank goodness, what we're seeing right now is the increasing possibility, increasing phenomenon of Indian history being written by Indians and being written by the standards of professional scholarship. And I can't end this presentation without giving you a slide from my own university. We have an Indigenous Studies program. These are some of our students in that program. So what we see then in the 50 years since the publication of this book then is this proliferation of new scholarship. How much we can attribute that to the publication of the book itself and D. Brown, I don't know, but I think it is a fair assumption that that book stirred up interest in American history in a way that certainly contributed to this remarkable change in our understanding of the Indian history of the American West. And with that, I will open up the floor to any questions you might have. Thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thank you so much for being here, Dr. West. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. If you can stop sharing your screen, there should be a no share. It's usually at the top.
Okay, stop share. Yeah, there it is. Okay.
And there we go. Now we're a little bit bigger. Our boxes are a little bit bigger. So we have a couple of questions, but I just, I was thinking a lot while you were talking about, and maybe it was your use of the word bonanza, but those TV shows, those Westerns, in particular the TV shows, my grandmother was a big fan of those, so I knew those, Bonanza, Gunsmoke, those, and the depiction of Native Americans, and then Dee Brown's book comes out, and the Native American is not the aggressor. The whites are the aggressors. And so that would be I think that'd be a fascinating study to look at that kind of the popular culture of it all.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I teach a course here on campus called "The West of the Imagination," which is a course on the sort of the myth of the West. And in fact, what you see, it begins really in the '60s, but certainly in the '70s, you see this reversal, especially in movies and films, where before you have ones, like I said, like The Searchers. Now you have ones in which the white guys are clearly the villains. So probably the most best known of these is Dances with Wolves, for example. So again, sort of it flips over, just sort of the way that Dee did it in his book.
Yes, yeah. So one of our questions is, would you recommend, we would like a recommendation of your 3 favorite books on the subject.
well, there are so many. One of the ones referring to the sort of things that I've talked about in the presentation. There's a book by Benjamin Madley, Madley, called An American Genocide. That's the one that looks so closely at California. That's not it's a tough book to read, but it's a very tough story. But it's a remarkable piece of scholarship. On the other hand, looking over at what we're talking about in the Great Plains, a book called The Comanche Empire. The Comanche Empire. That's by, I could spell it out for you, Pekka Hamalainen. Pekka Hamalainen is a native Finn, a brilliant historian, a very good friend of mine. He's now the Rhodes Professor of History at Oxford University. And this is a book that began as his dissertation, and it's the story of the rise of the Comanches as a sort of the superpower on the plains. Finally, there's so many books. Look at a book by Frederick Hoxie, Hoxie. It's a relatively recent book called This Indian Country. And what Hoxie does in this book is look at American Indian activists from the early 19th century all the way up into the 20th century to Vine Deloria Jr., the very well-known name. His point is that Indian peoples have always had their own advocates who have taken a role into preserving their way of life and to arguing for their protection under the system that is now dominated. So those are 3 that come to mind pretty quickly.
Okay, so apparently, now I fixed it. Apparently, nobody could see you. They could just.
Can they hear me?
Yes. So, okay, we got that fixed. Okay. I mean, today has just been a day for technology.
I guess so.
So and you may have, I was dealing with that tech issue, so I actually didn't hear your full answer. But we also have another question about a book for a lay reader that reflect a single volume that reflects the current scholarship and these changes in the narrative since Brown's book. So you probably,
single book?
Single book.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that there is one single book. It'd be very nice if someone would write that book to reflect that scholarship. I will say, sort of a bit of self-promotion. I have just submitted a book that I've been working on for 20 years called Creating the West. And it's about the emergence of the American West from 1848 until 1880. And in that, I've tried to integrate all of this new scholarship into that. But I don't know of a single volume that would, for the lay reader, that's available right now.
Okay, we got one more. Let me make sure in all that back and forth of not being able to see you if I missed anything. No, I did not. Okay, so here's one. What are the Native population trends today since bloodlines are mixed in modern times? How is Native identity determined?
Yeah, it's a very tricky question. Essentially, it's determined by the census, and the census is self-defining. When you take the census, you say who you are, where you fit into this. Native American is part of this resurgence that I was trying to stress as the last point. Has been a remarkable rebound of Native American population. It hit its low point around the opening of the 20th century, and that was about 250,000. It has now increased to several million. But again, how do you measure that? Because there is so much intermarriage. The number of full-blood Indian peoples is quite small, but the number of those who have significant percentages of native blood is far larger than that. And once again, it's what you say you are. So, for example, today, if you go back really at the time that Dee was writing, people who had significant amounts of native blood still did not declare themselves to be native because that was a stigma. That has almost reversed, so that now it's a point of pride if you have that in your background. And I have to say, there are those who will say that they are when they really aren't. Indian peoples call them wannabes, the tribe of wannabes. So it's a very tricky answer. But you can say that the population is far larger than it was at the opening of the 20th century, and it's statistically at least the most rapidly growing ethnic group in the United States today.
Yeah, someone mentioned, I think, the DNA testing, all of this genealogical DNA testing that's happening. And I think a lot of people are maybe learning that they were told that they had Native American heritage, and it's not.
Not the case.
Henry Louis Gates was here a couple of years ago, and he made a wonderful comment about that, your Cherokee great grandmother probably wasn't a Cherokee at all.
Yeah.
Let's see, we've got, I think this is a comment. Oh, someone is commenting back to the person who answered that question. Some tribes have rules around who qualifies for tribal membership and who doesn't, but also a lot of us natives figure the blood quantum is BS. If you're not raised native and consider yourself, if you're been raised native and consider yourself native, you're native.
Those are excellent points. When I talked about numbers before, I was talking about the U.S. Census. Mm-hmm. Tribal groups, of course, have their own definitions. A percentage, you have to go back and look at your lineage, and if you can show, 1/2, 1/4, 1/16, then you qualify to go on the tribal rolls. But as that last point was made, that's absolutely true. It's a self-identification, especially if you have been raised in that way of life, and by those values and by those cultures. Sure you are.
Did the Dawes roll still play an important part? The Dawes roll?
The Dawes roll. Well, it does in the questions that I was just addressing. Mm-hmm. One of the ways that you can establish yourself as a tribal member in many tribes is to show, as you go back and show a lineage from people who are on the Dawes rolls. It does not play the role, of course, that it did before. What the Dawes rolls did before, under the Dawes Act before, was to try to establish tribal membership as a step toward the dissolution of reservations and the parceling out of land from the reservations to the family. So, of course, that hasn't been done since the 1930s.
Well, thank you so much again for being here, for talking about this. This was very enlightening to me. It's been a long time since I've read the book, and I got a whole new perspective on Indian history. So I appreciate it very much.
You're quite welcome.
We are going to, so this will be on YouTube for those of you out there watching. If you, it'll take a couple of days. It won't be instantaneous like it is normally because we weren't streaming live. But I do want to make a note of the next Legacies in Lunch. So please join us next month when historian Nicholas Proctor discusses the legacy of his grandfather's book, his grandfather's Dee Brown, and the impact that it has had on his life. So mark your calendar for Wednesday, October 7th at noon. We'll be virtual again, and so you'll be able to register just like you did for today and come back and hear Dee Brown's grandson, who is a historian. He teaches at a small private liberal arts college in Iowa. So that should be interesting to hear his true legacy of Dee Brown. So, one quick last question. Do you still teach at Fayetteville?
I do, remotely at this point, but yeah, I do.
Well,
I
great.
love it. I love it. I love it here.
Thank you so much, Dr. West. We really appreciate it again. And thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Bye.
Appreciate it. Bye.